Hello, everyone. Today's video is going to be me going through ethical considerations and social sensitivity. This is one of these 6 issues and debates you need to know. And it is actually kind of an issue and a debate, but I'm not going to go into that. One thing to note straight from the off is that when we're talking about ethical implications or ethical considerations, they're the same thing. When we're talking about ethical considerations, that is very different to ethical guidelines, which we looked at in the first year. Ethical guidelines are things like informed consent, their deception, right to withdraw, protection from harm. These are ethical guidelines are what you should do within the research. Ethical considerations are things you need to take account of things that might happen after the research. So, for example, could you offend anybody with this research? Is this going to create stereotypes or prejudices? How socially sensitive is your piece of research? Some of the topics we look at are not offensive in the slightest. You know, things like memory is not particularly offensive. I guess social influence is not particularly that offensive, but actually a lot of what we look at could be considered offensive by some people. So, for example, looking at looking at schizophrenia and saying it's caused by biology, that's quite offensive to some people because you might be looking at your family now being like, oh shit, I'm going to get schizophrenia. So many pieces of research are unethical in what they suggest. Let me try and explain it better. So one thing to take into account is all research good? Is it good for society? Is it good for our understanding of human behavior? But as future psychologists or as future researchers, certainly, what you are going to need to start increasingly think about is not so much your ethics when you do the study, though that is important. You need to think of the ethics about, what are the potential implications of what could happen as a result of your piece of research? Could your bad piece of research, could your unethical piece of research be used by far right or far right extremists, for example, far right or far left extremists, sorry. So it's definitely something to consider. Could you cause harm to anybody with your piece of research? Could you create stereotypes? Could it back up undesirable points of view? So you do need to take that into account. And what may seem like a very innocent research project can actually have very far-reaching social consequences. And a good example of this is this example just down here. Now, if you look at this doesn't look like it's that offensive. On the face of it, it seems like it's a good piece of research to do. It seems like actually it's a piece of research we probably could come up with practical applications with. Research that compares the cognitive abilities of infants in daycare compared to infants brought up at home. Now, that doesn't actually look quite offensive, but let's imagine, as we would probably find, and we probably would find this, that actually infants raised in daycare would be significantly further ahead than those raised at home. If you're a mother reading this piece of research in a newspaper, for example, and it's saying, daycare kids, very clever, children reared at home, thick, you might be offended by that piece of research. Now, that's not to say it's not true. That's not to say it's not true, but all of a sudden you're telling that mother that she's raising a very stupid child because of her choices. That suddenly becomes quite offensive and quite concerning to a subset of people. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about the term social sensitivity. There are a lot of theories we look at that are quite offensive, I'm not going to lie. Anything in psychopathology, mostly. A lot in addiction, schizophrenia, a lot of relationships actually is actually quite offensive. Anything deterministic is offensive because it suggests we have no control, so it concerns people. So this is a really, really useful AO3 for a lot of the spec. So let's go into a bit more detail here. How do we actually get rid of unethical pieces of research? So as it says here, one way to deal with socially sensitive research is just to not do it. just to avoid it. For example, and here's the classic. Imagine we want to find if men or women are more intelligent. Imagine we want to find if men and women are more intelligent. Who out of men and women are more intelligent? Now, do we need to do that piece of research? I think yes. I think we do need to do that piece of research because the goal of psychology is to find out truth. But we know if we find that one is more intelligent than the other, there are going to be major societal implications. If we found out hypothetically, not that this is true, but let's say we find out that men are more intelligent than women, which again is not true. That it's roughly equal, but that's not the point. Women would then be denied top jobs. They'd be ridiculed for thinking they could apply for the top jobs. They'd be encouraged to stay at home. Their opportunities would be limited, and will basically set society back about 50, 60 years. Now, I don't think avoiding doing that piece of research is a very, very good thing. So whilst you can suggest this, you have to argue that it's not a particularly good choice. And let me tell you why. So the APA reported that ethical committees approved 95% of non-sensitive proposals that didn't include ethical problems, whereas sensitive proposals were approved only 50% of the time. Now, that doesn't answer the question. This answers the question. Firstly, researchers are unlikely to submit sensitive research proposals if they're not going to be approved. Why would you try to do a piece of research if it's not going to be approved? Secondly, what might happen, and this is probably the more important point, is that if we then go, you know what, let's not research intelligence differences in anybody. Let's not look at the differences between ethnicities, for example. Let's not look at the differences in intelligence between men and women, old and young, boys and girls or whatever. That will become a taboo topic that we really don't want to happen, right? We really, really don't want to happen. I cannot emphasize enough how avoiding doing the sensitive piece of research, that's a really, really bad way to go. It's a really bad way to go. The point of psychology is to discover truths about behavior. We should not be sweeping things under the carpet. So you need to be careful in saying what all this is leading to. You need to be careful when you say, oh, we shouldn't do that really offensive piece of research. That's not a solution. We should do the piece of research, but we should think about how we're going to provide the results. We should think about how is going to be reported in the academic papers. We should think about keeping confidentiality and stuff like this. So there's a couple of examples just here of what could be considered sensitive pieces of research. To be perfectly honest with you, this is probably the easiest one: schizophrenic mother, which we looked at in psychology in schizophrenia. That said that cold and distant mothers tend to create schizophrenic children. Now, again, why is that offensive? If you have a schizophrenic child, you're going to read that as being blamed for their disorder, that your parenting style caused them to have this debilitating mental health disorder, which pretty much decimated their life. So you do need to be careful about how you disseminate pieces of research. Now, yeah, that's pretty straightforward, to be honest. Academics who sit on these ethical boards may spot potential pitfalls or negative implications. So if you are putting your piece of research through, it's quite sensitive, you would hope that the ethical boards would actually collapse it. Now, I will go into a little bit about BPS. I don't want to go into this about too much, but you do need to know 4 elements of the BPS here. So these are the ethical guidelines, different to the ones we looked at last year. They're a different set of ethical guidelines, but you kind of need to know these 4. You kind of need to know these 4. I guess a better way to phrase this would be ethical principles. So, for example, all researchers need to show respect for all participants. If you're being socially sensitive, you're not doing that. All researchers need to be competent, i.e. they need to be good at their job. They need to have professional knowledge, update CPD. They need to write their reports clearly, not ambiguously, for example. They need to take responsibility. So again, I'm not being funny, but if you're creating inaccurate stereotypes about people based off your research, that's not particularly being responsible, and the need to show integrity as well. Now, AQA at the time of filming this have never actually asked about these four, though they technically are in the STEM. So if they do ask about ethical principles of behavior, I would want you to talk about these four. But where we really know the AO1 here is Sieber and Stanley. This is the main AO1 I want you talking about. So Sieber and Stanley came up with four things you need to take into account when potentially doing unethical pieces of research. So they were the people that came up with the term social sensitivity, and they said that kind of if you're not taking care of these four principles, which I'm going to go through in a second, you are potentially engaging in socially sensitive research. So the first one is the research question. Again, this has got to be your AO1. You've got to consider your research question carefully and considerately. So you can't have any leading questions, right? So for example, if you were to say, and the example there, are there racial differences in IQ? You're kind of saying that there are, or are men more intelligent than women? That's a leading question. You're already biasing your piece of research, because people reading that will go, oh, I didn't think there was, but now you've said it, maybe there is. So your research question, which you kind of write before your aim, your research question is basically a question aimed at what you are looking at. You've got to word that very, very carefully. So the second one to take into account is the methodology used. So is it offensive to people? Is it not well done ethically? Like Milgram, for example, did you keep confidentiality? Are you keeping them anonymous? And I do have a bit of a conundrum here, actually. Look at this example just here. If someone admits to having unprotected sex, if they're HIV positive, should the researcher maintain confidentiality? Well, on one hand, no, because they've harmed someone and given someone potentially a disorder that is going to kill them. On the other hand, we should keep that confidential. Think about the consequences if you don't. If you then go to the police and say, oh, my participant come up to me and said this, think about the ethical implications that has on just psychology in general. Nobody is ever going to trust psychology again. Nobody is ever going to take part in a piece of research. And all of a sudden, psychology's quest for behavioral truths is going to dry up, because we're not going to be able to get the participants, because nobody's going to trust it. So Sieber and Stanley say actually one thing you need to consider is how you are actually doing the piece of research. And that, by the way, is where these ethical guidelines, informed consent, so on and so forth, this is where they come in. But I think the two most important ones are the next two. So Sieber and Stanley also said that you need to take into account what's called the institutional context. And what this means is basically who is funding the research. Who is funding the research? If you are, let me give an example. Imagine a piece of research finds that smoking is not harmful. Smoking is not harmful for people, and that actually smoking's effect on lung cancer has been grossly over-exaggerated. Imagine a piece of research says this. Sieber and Stanley say that the reason why you need to take into account the institutional context is you need to understand who is funding that. Is there a chance that the research is biased towards who is funding that? Now imagine that smoking piece of research, I tell you, was conducted by BAT, the British American Tobacco Company, who are based in Southampton. Right? All of a sudden, that you can quite clearly see how unethical that is, to tell people, because you have a stake, to tell people that smoking is healthy, or at least not unhealthy, just because you want to sell more cigarettes. That is grossly unethical. that is incredibly offensive to a lot of people whose family might have died of lung cancer, for example. So you do need to take into account where or who is financing it. Probably, if I'm honest, probably the most important bit here. Say you've done your whole piece of research. The last thing to take into account is how you are going to sell your results, how you are going to discuss your results, how you are going to put your results out into the public. Now, please write this down. You need to be aware of how the public are going to interpret your findings. Imagine, are some of the red top newspapers like the Sun or the Mirror quite sensationalist newspapers? Are they going to have an agenda, for example? If they were to say that, if you were to say that there are intelligence differences and blah, 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 are they going to jump on that and say that women need to stay at home and that men should be all CEOs, for example? Because if you say that, they are going to say that massive, like they're going to amplify that tenfold. So the researcher needs to consider how their findings might be interpreted and applied in the real world. And this is really important, could your results be used to inform government policy and new laws? So you need to be careful about how you show the public your results, and you do that by writing your report in a really considerate manner. So this is much more likely going to be the question that you get. How do you actually deal with socially sensitive research? The answer is not to not do it. That's not the answer at all, right? I cannot express to you enough. That is not the answer at all. These are things you should take into account. You should carefully consider what the implications will be and discuss these with colleagues. You should brief participants about the potential implications of the research and say, look, there is a chance this is going to offend some people. Do you still want to take part in the research? You want to get informed consent from them, give them the right to withdraw, but probably that bottom one is the most important. You want to, as it's the last point of the last slide, you want to publish with discretion and perhaps give a carefully worded introduction, right? You want to be aware that your research is going to be offensive. So in terms of evaluations, this is probably the hardest part. This is quite a tough debate to evaluate. But one thing to consider, it could be more beneficial to have offensive research. Why? You avoid that behavior becoming taboo. And in psychology, we want no taboo subjects. We want no behavior unturned. We want to look at all behavior. But also, and this is a really, really important point, if you conduct socially sensitive research and it finds, say men are more intelligent than women, we can now focus on how to improve female intelligence. If we constantly just go, no, they're all even, without really doing the research, no, men and women, they're even, without doing the research, then we're not going to be able to fix any higher level or lower level, right? Now, as it turns out, men and women are equally intelligent, but imagine if you did find men were significantly more intelligent, or women significantly more intelligent than men, you can then help the other sex. You could look at why they are not as intelligent and then have practical applications, for example. If, for example, schizophrenic mother was correct and mums did cause their kid to have schizophrenia, we can then treat that by teaching parents, don't be cold and distant with your kid, right? Which we should be teaching them anyway, because when was that ever good? But a major benefit to doing socially sensitive research is that it generates a whole load of practical applications which are going to help particular subsets of the population. That's a really important point, and I think I described that clearly enough. So if you're still there confused, maybe scroll back 2 minutes or so. That's probably the most important point. The problem, though, is that if you continue to do socially sensitive and offensive pieces of research, psychology is going to damage its reputation as a science. People are going to view it as antagonistic, provocative, quite aggressive, maybe a bit conservative, maybe. It's going to create prejudices and stereotypes, and it's going to just offend people. And long term, people aren't going to like that. Long term, psychology will damage its reputation, and it will essentially, it could suggest that a certain type of person is better than others, which, we're going down the eugenics route there. So clearly that is going to be a bit of a problem for psychology. However, we still talk about Milgram. We still talk about Zimbardo. We still talk about Ash. These unethical pieces of research are among the pieces of research most highly held in regard. So you could argue, just saying, socially sensitive research promotes a lot of conversation. Socially sensitive research promotes a lot of research. It instigates a lot of research, a lot of interest, and that is never necessarily a bad thing. So I've got two strengths here of why you would do socially sensitive research. You could obviously criticize that as well. And that is essentially the debate. Now, in terms of actually writing a peel, this is what I've done for the strength of why it might be good. So my point here, quite short, quite sharp: unethical research may actually benefit society more than it hinders it. Boom. Now I need to give a piece of evidence, and I can bring that in from anywhere, remember. I could bring that in from anywhere. For example, the identification of intelligence differences between the sexes may elicit more focus on intervention techniques, which will bring the lower intelligence group up to equality. Failure to identify these differences will only maintain the differences. So, for example, if you don't research whether men and women are different, then you're not going to be able to help one of those sexes. Elaborate. Why is this good? Why is it bad? Therefore, unethical research may help society through the identification of disadvantages. Though it may be offensive, this type of research could actually be useful, and therefore researchers should not shy away from sensitive research, as it does have its uses. Now, that would be one peel for this. You would need to write some other ones. Now, this question at the top here is a typical question that you're going to get. Discuss one or more ethical implications of research in society. Refer to at least one topic you have got. So you've got an AO1 here, an AO2, and an AO3 as well. It might be worth just pausing this to have a look at what you could write about. This is what you would write about in your AO1. Now for this, AO1 would only be worth 3. So clearly you do not have to talk about all of this. But what would you talk about? What would you talk about? One thing we haven't really spoken about actually is economic implications. So if, funding for disabilities is often based upon research done on those disabilities. So let's just say, for example, hypothetically, there's a condition called fibromyalgia. It's fatigue disorder. A few of my students have had it. It's pretty debilitating. There is a small group out there that don't believe in fibromyalgia. They don't believe it. They just think it's people being tired and they should just go to sleep more, right? I want to imagine that one of those group of people do a piece of research and they find that fibromyalgia is not actually a thing, as they have said before. That could affect funding and research into this disorder. Now, I had fatigue really badly when I had COVID. And it was awful. True fatigue is awful, so bad. But if a piece of research kind of suggests that a disorder is not as bad as it seems, and people can have a quality of life, that's going to hugely affect the funding that goes into that disorder, and thus that disorder is only going to get worse and more misunderstood. So There are economic implications, particularly around funding, if you downplay or overplay a piece, like a disorder, for example, um, which is something worth looking into. You've got AO2 just there, which I would want you to bring in one of those for AO2, and then you've got some evaluations here. If you do want to have a look at some of the other ones that I've gone with, these are some of the other evaluations you could bring in. I think the best one is this one, though. I do think the best one is this one. For socially sensitive research, you have to do a cost benefit analysis. There are some offensive pieces of research. I'm sorry, they're just worth it. They're just worth it, right? So they are worth doing, but also how researchers can deal with the implications. That is pretty much it for this one, apart from me saying that I have written up a model answer just here. Now, it might be worth this is clearly AO1 here, AO2, and then AO3. It's for this question we've just looked at. It might be worth, and I'll just scroll down in a second, but it might be worth just pausing this just to read this, to actually wrap your head around how much you should be writing. But there's AO1. You've got an AO2 just there, and I've actually used the Dr. Wakefield example with MMR causing autism. That was an incredibly socially sensitive piece of research. It was awful. It was more biology than psychology, but it was truly, truly an awful piece of research. By the way, that has had way more cost than benefit. Way more cost. So that piece of research should never have been done in the first place. But then I've also got a very good peel there as well, which I think is probably worth reading. That is it for this bullet point, and I think this is my last one of debates. But hope this was useful. Know how to evaluate this. That's all I can say. Peace out.